Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoy this series, make sure you subscribe to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and like us on Facebook to watch our latest interviews. And of course, visit our website, b'naibrith.org, to learn more about our humanitarian and advocacy efforts across the globe. While there have been Jewish communities in the United States since colonial times, few eras have proven as consequential as the Gilded Age for the history of American Jewry. A new anthology titled Yearning to Breathe Free, Jews in Gilded Age America, Essays by 20 Scholars, delves into the key themes, figures, and developments in American Jewish life during the latter half of the 1800s and their impact on the century that followed. Two of the book's contributing authors, Dr. Samantha Baskind of Cleveland State University and Dr. Daniel Sawyer of Fordham University, have spoken with us before on our Conversations series. Today, we're incredibly fortunate to welcome one of the book's co-editors, who is among America's most prominent historians. Dr. Jonathan Sarna is the Joseph H. and Belle R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University and co-editor of Yearning to Breathe Free, along with Adam Mendelsohn. He's also a past president of the Association for Jewish Studies, chief historian of the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia, and co-chair of the advisory board of the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. Dr. Sarna is one of the foremost scholars of American Jewish history, and his publications include Lincoln and the Jews, A History with Benjamin Chappell, and When General Grant Expelled the Jews. Today, Dr. Sarna joins me to discuss Yearning to Breathe Free and to explore the developments in the Gilded Age that shaped Jewish life in the 20th century across topics ranging from art and music to politics and religion and beyond. Dr. Sarna, Jonathan, we're really glad to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you, and it's always a joy to be with you.
Well, let's talk first about, this is the usual question for authors, but it's the most important. What inspired the publication of Yearning to Breathe Free? And did you and co-editor Adam Mendelsohn intend this book of essays to spur a reassessment of the Jewish contributions to American Jewish life post-Civil War to the late 19th century? And is it geared more toward general readers or to historians?
Those are wonderful questions. Let me take them one at a time. I should give credit to Leonard Milberg, who is the sponsor of the book. He was in touch with me and asked me, is there a period in American Jewish life that has been insufficiently studied? And, he said, I'd love to advance the field. And it seemed to me that the Gilded Age, although clearly very important, was very unstudied. The majority of faculty in the field moved from the Civil War, and then you moved to East European Jewish immigration as if the period in between didn't happen. And even more important, many of the well-known Central European Jews sort of disappear from the story as we move to Eastern Europe, as if they just vanished. Indeed, at least one scholar thought, well, they assimilated out of existence. They disappear. Well, they didn't disappear. That's why we have a big book here. They just hadn't been looked at. And so Adam Mendelsohn and I really persuaded the cream of the crop in Jewish historical studies to look at this period and make a contribution. I think that the essays are readable. They're not arcane or jargon-filled. And thanks in part to Leonard Milberg, it's a beautiful book filled with photographs and images that nobody has ever seen. It's really, in a way, like a catalog. And experts will discover that it is just filled with new material. We were very eager for the volume to reflect social, political, economic, cultural, and religious developments. That's a tall order. That's why it's a big book. But really, it's full of good materials showing that the period is of great importance. So, I very much hope that people will read it, study it, and understand just how significant it is. I will say, B'nai B'rith was very significant centrally in this period, and anyone who reads it will see all sorts of people who indeed were central in the world of B'nai B'rith. But also, I have to say, we made sure there were women in this book and paid attention also to them. Yeah.
We associate the Gilded Age, as per the name given to the period by Mark Twain, with wealth represented by one strata of society. In the Jewish community, it was the Belmont, Strauss, and Schiff families. But what are some of the key revelations about Jewish life in that era as a whole?
So, yes, we talk about some of those people who did remarkable things, and there's a much longer list in the volume, but it's an era where this was a surprise to all of us, as Zev Elef showed. The holiday of Purim was revived in America during this period. The holidays not much talked about before the Civil War, but the big events of the year in the Gilded Age were amazing Purim balls that really brought out Jews in this period, and those balls were covered in newspapers, and actually we have drawings of one of the balls in the volume that have never, the drawings have never been seen before. There is a very significant article on anti-Semitism, something we should not forget in that period. And one of the leading figures, Nina Mariaschin, who fought anti-Semitism and whose article, still worth reading, is a wonderful portrayal of what it meant that suddenly Jews were excluded from institutions, in some cases, that they had helped build, and what anti-Semitism meant, especially to children. I think perhaps as a woman, she was especially sensitive. Some will recognize her middle name, which was Moraes. Her father was Sabato Moraes, a very significant Philadelphia Sephardic rabbi and founder of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Of course, we deal with religious developments. My own article in the volume really talks about the rabbinate on the cusp of change, moving from a small number of rabbis, the most well-known being the great Reform rabbi of Temple Emmanuel, Gustav Gottheil, to a new world where you'd have East European Orthodox rabbis. You had clashes between rabbis like Gottheil and the great Reform rabbis of an earlier era trained in Germany. and rabbis born and trained in America. In this period, you have the first ordained Hebrew Union College American born rabbis, and that changes a great deal. And really, one gets a glimpse of a new world of American religion. And in many of these volumes, there is a document or an image that, in a sense, is used to talk about the period as a whole. And I found this spoof of the rabbinate called Chronicles of the Rabbis. Amazing, a spoof, privately printed, and with Gilbert and Sullivan tunes applied to the rabbinate. A reminder of how popular Gilbert and Sullivan, the Mikado, was. It was by far the most popular musical of the day. Jews also were caught up in Mikado mania, as the shows, but the spoof really gives you a sense of tensions, Orthodox, Reform, Old and New, East European and German, within the rabbinate.
Let me ask you, if I can, about demography and geography. So we know you mentioned the Moraes family, Philadelphia, of course, New York, the big cities of the Northeast. But by the time the Gilded Age begins, we're talking about the Midwest, and we're talking about other places. Tell us about, in this book, would you say, how much is written about that demographic shift, things that are happening in Ohio, for example, or in some other part of the country?
And it's really a wonderful question. First of all, it's hard to remember, but in this period up to 1900 at least, you don't even have 1 million Jews. And in 1880, that's a good number, is 250,000, meaning that a great many Jews are coming in, mostly from Eastern Europe in the late 1870s, and then especially following the pogroms in 1880s, 1890s. Yes, the Midwest, Cincinnati is very important in this period. Hebrew Union College, 1875. And Isaac Wise, the great leader of the Reform movement, really imagines that Cincinnati will be the center of American Judaism. But actually, you begin to see hints that just as Cincinnati is declining and is not going to be a center of America by World War I, so its place in American Jewish life is changing. Part of the reason Cincinnati didn't become central in America was because of the railroad. Cincinnati didn't encourage the railroad. They thought it was a foolish invention. The water was free, and they'd invested a lot of money in the river trade. And so the railroad people went to Chicago, then a backwoods community. And Chicago, in many ways, became what Cincinnati had hoped to become. And Jewish life, too, begins to move in that direction. By the time the Gilded Age ends, Chicago is a much more important community. I was very happy that we have an important essay on San Francisco. One of the little-known facts of American Jewish history is that there was a brief moment when San Francisco was the second largest Jewish community in the United States, around 1879, 1880. There'd been, of course, a vast gold rush and lots of money to be made in San Francisco. This is before the fire. And what is important, and we talk about, you had some early Jewish novelists, many of them women, writing in San Francisco. But of course, with the coming of East European Jews, the balance is going to shift to the east. And San Francisco itself is going to be buffeted both by earthquakes and by competition from Los Angeles. So it's really a fascinating moment. We have Samantha Baskin, whom you mentioned at the top, has very important material on Jewish artists during this period. It's also a period where we see the statues of Moses Ezekiel, including one organized, we should say, by B'nai B'rith, which persuaded Ezekiel to do a statue on religious liberty, which still stands in Philadelphia, and today, not then, but today, is in front of the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History. But that is this period, and this was really from a Jewish contribution to a big fair that was held in Philadelphia in honor of the American Centennial, which of course falls in our period. This is a period where we begin to see American Jews producing music, including synagogue music that is still known. In other words, we're seeing Jews in the United States emerge. The children of immigrants are American Jews. They're born in America. They're patriotic. They've been educated. And they want to develop American Jewish life. And we see them really moving in directions that had not been seen before, when the theme was simply how do we get immigrants to assimilate, to become comfortable in their country. These folks are struggling. Can we be these folks we're writing about? Can we be Americans and Jews? And what does that entail? And what arenas is that? And I should say, this is also a period in to see American Jews engaging significantly in the political arena. You have a man, well, Simon Wolf, a very significant leader of B'nai B'rith, who's an advisor to presidents. We didn't have a Jew who was an advisor to presidents prior to the Gilded Age. And you see Jews in public life. You see interest in getting involved in elections, in politics, and so on. David Dallin has a whole big chapter on politics and public life. This is the period that begins to happen in a very significant way.
Let me ask you a question about methodology. The thematic essays in Yearning to Breathe Free each use a primary source, a book, a newspaper, a tract, artwork, as an entry point into the era. For those of us who may not be as familiar with the scholarly process, why is using primary sources so important?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because one of the great challenges today is figuring out what truth is. How do I determine what's true? What really happened? What's fake news? What can I rely on? And I would say in my teaching and also in this book, I've begun to use a lot more primary sources. Let's go back and see what really happened from a document that none of us can dispute, so that it's not just a matter of interpretation. And that's one of the reasons why we have footnotes, we have pictures of the original material. Let's be sure that this is not just an effort to write our personal political objectives into the past, but that we are really building upon what happened. And the wonderful thing is, it's never been easier to do. When I started in history, you had to go to an archive, only a specialist. There were a very small number of great libraries that had books from this period. You had to go there. Now, many of the books have been scanned and are available to anybody with a computer. And a lot of the papers have been scanned and pictures. So I think it's easier than ever before for somebody who wonders what really happened. How do I go back to the period and look at it on my own rather than relying on someone else? Now you can do that. And that's, in a sense, what we are showing. I think we're also, for sophisticated readers, letting you in to see how historians work. You take a document, you read it very carefully, you master it, you see things in it, and you can use it to shed light on a whole period. And that's part of the goal.
Let's go back to the book, to the Gilded Age. How did, as you mentioned, books and libraries, how did magazines take on a powerful role for all Americans? And what kinds of magazines, for example, this mass media, such as it was in those days, what kind of magazines did Jews specifically read? Were there some devoted to women's interests? Were they as specialized then as they ultimately became?
It's really wonderful, and of course, it's the era when we begin to see this happening. Prior to the Civil War, you had a small number of Jewish newspapers, the best known, the Occident and the Israelite. And that was it. There were no magazines, but printing technology greatly improved, and you do begin. You have B'nai B'rith has a magazine in the late 19th century that is significant, and then you have this quite remarkable. It's all online. The American Jewess, which is for American Jewish women, and you have some early efforts at scholarly magazines for Jews. This is a sign of a more cultured, better educated community, but it does also reflect the fact that it's easier and cheaper to produce the printed word and send it out. And there are lots of writers. There were young people, the young Henrietta Zoll, later the founder of Hadassah, but the young Henrietta Zoll is sending regular letters to the Jewish Messenger. That's how she learned how to write, in a way, and they're very worth reading, lively. And lots of other young people did that. We also see, by the way, a children's magazine, the Sabbath Visitor, and there's another children's magazine later that has contributions by Horatio Alger. These were designed to make Jewish education livelier, more interesting, more inviting for young people. Themes that I think people will be amazed. Boy, they were saying some of that in the late 19th century. And of course, we still say it today. It's a perennial.
Let's talk about some of the institutions that were created towards the end of the 19th century. You've referenced B'nai B'rith. And by the way, our magazine is still, I think, the longest continuously published magazine in the Jewish community. But towards the end of the 19th century, B'nai B'rith had lodges all over America, members established, and they supported public institutions, hospitals, orphanages. Tell us about institutions of higher learning, both secular and religious, that were begun by Jewish individuals and others during the Gilded Age. Was this kind of a coming of age in terms of Jewish philanthropy?
So exactly right. I think first of all, American Jewry is not the tiny community that it was, say, in 1800. Think of a community that has moved from a couple of thousand to, as I say, by 1900, it's just under a million. That's a serious community. And they're in a country that is growing quickly, and not just growing in numbers, but growing in world influence. World War One, of course, is going to demonstrate that in a big way. And American Jewry didn't want to play second fiddle to Europe. We need to train our own rabbis. These will be rabbis who will understand America, who will know English, who will be appropriate for America. And so you have first Hebrew Union College, and then you have the Jewish Theological Seminary. B'nai B'rith plays a big role in the early establishment of Jewish libraries. How are we going to help people learn and read and so on? We see the beginning of the Jewish book. It's quite fascinating. It's not here, but I've published and elsewhere how you can see decade by decade more Jewish books published in America. And the quality of those books is really going up. You're beginning to see books that Europeans are going to read. And there are books in the late 19th century that are still used today. Anyone who studies Talmud uses Jastro's dictionary. Well, Jastrow was an American rabbi, and Jastro's dictionary was published in America. And in the early 20th century, by far the greatest cultural contribution that American Jews made to Jewish scholarship and life, of the Jewish Encyclopedia, which every serious person, every library, every serious Jew had the Jewish Encyclopedia in their home, a kind of summary of all Jewish knowledge. And lo and behold, it was produced, and by the way, magnificently produced, in the United States. The chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Shuli Schwartz, wrote a wonderful book on that subject. So this is really an amazing era, really a coming out era for American Jews, and they're making their presence felt not only in the United States, but on the world Jewish scene as well.
I can just picture when I studied at Brandeis in graduate school. I think the Jewish Encyclopedia was, correct me if I'm wrong, 6 volumes. I think was it, or something like that. And I can still see it on the shelf, and kind of in wonderment of this this amazing product for that period of time when there was so much influx in terms of immigration, the communities growing, and the Jews moving up the economic ladder, at least in the beginning. So quite an impressive achievement. You referenced earlier.
I think some of our listeners may be interested. Actually, the Jewish Encyclopedia is more read today than at any time because it's all been scanned in. It's, of course, out of copyright, all been scanned in. And there are a lot of subjects. You still do pretty well looking at the Jewish Encyclopedia that's now on online. They have a little note there. How come the Jewish Encyclopedia doesn't have any articles on the Holocaust and on Israel? And of course, the reason is neither had happened in 1900, 1906. Yeah.
Well, I'll have to revisit it because I remember really how impressed I was by it. You referenced earlier how prevalent anti-Semitism in the United States was during this period. How did it manifest itself?
I think we have not sufficiently appreciated the depth of anti-Semitism, in part because it didn't fit the image American Jews had of America. Anti-Semitism begins to be widely publicized in the late 1870s, which is also when the word anti-Semitism really enters the English language. There was Jew hatred and wickedness before, but anti-Semitism is invented then, brought from Germany. But it becomes publicized when one of the foremost American Jews, much talked about in this book, the banker Joseph Seligman, is kept out of the Grand Union Hotel, one of the great hotels, because they've decided they are not anymore going to accept Jews. And soon after that, not so many Jews could afford to go to the Grand Union Hotel, but soon after that, Coney Island announces it will not be open to Jews. And that opens up a very significant debate. I remember we're in the Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction era when African Americans, at exactly the same moment in the 1870s, are being restricted by Jim Crow laws. What kind of country do we want to live in? And there were plenty of people who wanted to live in a country where groups that you didn't like could be excluded. Well, aren't I free to keep blacks out, to keep Jews out? Now, the situation of Jews was not as dire. There were never separate water fountains for Jews, but there were a lot of separate Jewish institutions, country clubs. You're going to see Jewish hospitals. You're going to see and you're going to see Jews are more and more consolidated in their own areas. And in part, that's because they were not free to live anywhere, to vacation anywhere. And all of that is part of the legacy of the Gilded Age. Their freedom is going to be defined to include the freedom to exclude folks. And that's not really going to be changed until World War II. So this period from the Gilded Age to World War II is going to see much more anti-Semitism than we've been willing to talk about. And of course, B'nai B'rith played a role in fighting this. Why did we need an anti-defamation league founded by B'nai B'rith? The teaching of contempt, of course, the immediate impetus was the lynching of Leo Frank, but far harder for Jews. Banks, they wouldn't employ Jews. What used to be called white gumshoe law firms, the great law firms in America, wouldn't employ Jews. The great accounting firms wouldn't employ Jews. And a great many universities introduce quotas. Jews can be 4% and no more. And we know from each university had its own number, but we know from people who've gone into their records, there were places they literally counted and stopped when they reached that number. That, of course, is why my own university, Brandeis University, is going to be opened right after World War II with a mandate that there will be no quotas. Merit is going to determine who gets in. So this era is a very important one. We see all sorts of advances by Jews, but at the same time, we see people who want to restrict Jews, who are prejudiced against Jews, who are deeply disturbed that America is changing. And I have to say, as we worked on this book, we realized there are a lot of parallels to our own time, where people felt, wow, there's much more anti-Semitism than we had before. Conditions are getting worse, not better. America is changing. There are people who are uncomfortable about those changes. All of those themes we've seen already in the late 19th, early 20th century. And that makes it an important era to revisit, remembering that at one and the same time, it was, so to speak, the best of times and the worst of times. And that's often true in Jewish history. And we have to hold both of those things together. You can have great cultural advances, even when there are anti-Semitic restrictions and limitations. And both are going on in this era.
A couple of questions before we conclude. Talk about waves of immigration and the Gilded Age. So you have, before 1848, you have the colonial period, and then a little bit into the 19th century. Then after 1848, from Central Europe, German Jews, so forth. Then the big wave from 1880 on, let's say, to 1924. Now, though we haven't mentioned it explicitly yet, the Gilded Age ushered in significant changes in lifestyles, beliefs, social conventions that we associate with modernity. How did the 40-year wave of Eastern European and Russian immigration that began in more or less in 1880 factor in this transformation? And did the Jews who had lived in the U.S. for at least one generation, you've referenced them already, a new generation born already in the United States, how did those families from countries like Germany or other places, let's say in Central Europe, welcome the new arrivals who were coming in?
So again, of course, that's crucial, and these East European Jews are going to vastly outnumber the Jews we talk about here, so much so that the kinds of Germanic names that readers of this book will see become uncommon, except maybe a Temple Emmanuel, and East European names rise up. I think there's ambivalence, and that's the key word. On the one hand, and we sometimes forget this, these Central European Jews did a tremendous amount to help the East Europeans when they arrived. They donate charitably, they open institutions. There are schools. The first night school for immigrants, everyone has forgotten, was again Henrietta Zold, who was so amazing. But I mentioned libraries. There was a library for East European Jews set up. The two communities did not live close together in most communities, but for the simple reason that the immigrants tended to live near the port. They were very poor, and a second generation Central European Jews had made it and were living in wealthier areas. There's a lot of social distance between Yiddish speaking, often traditional or radical Jews from Eastern Europe. You had both. And these rather solid, but often deeply assimilated Jews. from Central Europe. Many East European Jews found Reform Judaism uh, strange, hard to accept. So, on the one hand, there is tension, but when we look back, we also know there were remarkable figures who made an enormous difference in the lives of East European Jews. And you had people like Louis Marshall, probably the greatest Jewish lawyer of his day within the Jewish community, who was going to bat for Eastern European Jews in terms of trying to keep America's doors open. And certainly B'nai B'rith and many Jewish organizations fight very hard to keep those doors open. They eventually fail in 1924 when quotas come. Before then, you had other limitations. There are certainly Jews come after 24, but it's greatly reduced. But Jews knew that if we keep East European Jews out of America, those folks may well die. There wasn't a state of Israel they could go to. And indeed, tragically, we know that the closing of America's gates indeed meant that when so many Jews needed refuge in the 1930s, only a small percentage were able to find refuge. But we should remember that the fact that the doors remained open as long as they did, there were, after all, restrictionist efforts from the 1880s, the same people who kept out Asian immigrants, Chinese Exclusion Act, wanted to keep out Jews. Both of them they felt were racially inferior, but Jews managed to keep those doors open. And of course, we know that in a way that saved Jewish life by allowing millions to come. In the same way, I mentioned the coming of books. This is the period when great Jewish libraries are going to be established. Think of the Library of Jewish Theological Seminary, Hebrew Union College, New York Public, Library of Congress. All of them are established prior to World War I. That saved Jewish culture. When the Nazis came and destroyed Jewish books, Jews could find those books transferred in America. There were copies. Had it not been for this great period of book production, the whole history of Jewish culture and civilization would be different. So my hope is that this book and other work on this era will force us to rethink the way we presented the history of American Jews. It's not that East European Jews came, they overwhelmed the earlier community, took it over, and those other folks disappeared. No, it's that the two communities each made important contributions. East European Jews benefited in important ways from what the Central European Jews had done.
One final question. How would you describe in a nutshell the changes that marked the era of the Gilded Age that affected Jewish life and affects it today?
I think many of the institutions created in the Gilded Age have continued to play a central role in American Jewish life. In many ways, the idea of a national Jewish community working together to solve certain problems and issues, that's a product of the Gilded Age. The involvement and engagement of Jews in government is, of course, even more important today. You're in Washington than it was then, but it was scarcely known prior to the Civil War. And again, decade by decade, one can see more Jews in public life. During this period, you're going to see the first Jewish cabinet member, Oscar Strauss. So there are many themes that we see in their infancy, so to speak, in this period that are then going to become very, very important, I think, in the 20th century. And and then there are themes like anti-Semitism that tend to be cyclical, and there's much to be learned from the way Jews both experienced and responded to anti-Semitism then, that I think may still be valuable for American Jews to understand today.
Yearning to Breathe Free, Jews in Gilded Age America, Essays by 20 Contributing Scholars, is available online at the Princeton University Art Museum Store, princetonmuseumstore.org. Jonathan Sarna, thank you for guiding us through Jewish life during America's consequential Gilded Age. This is a wonderful contribution to the understanding of Jewish history in the United States. It's been a true pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. It was a joy to be with you.
Thank you again to Dr. Jonathan Sarna and to you for watching this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed this interview, subscribe to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and like us on Facebook for all of our latest content. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. For my guest, Dr. Jonathan Sarna, I'm Dan Mariaschin. Join us again soon.